Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Imagine walking into an exam room to conduct a routine prostate screening on a female patient.
Right, which sounds like a massive scheduling error to most people.
Exactly. I mean, if that sounds like a typo to you, you might not be fully prepared for modern primary care. For decades, we've been taught to read this very fixed clinical map, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Male anatomy in column A, female anatomy in column B.
Right. And the guidelines tell you exactly which algorithms to follow based on, well, a single checkbox on an intake form. So, okay, let's unpack this. What happens when a patient's physical landscape just doesn't perfectly match that original map?
That is usually the exact moment provider anxiety sets in.
Yeah, big time.
You feel like you've completely lost your compass. But the foundational tools of clinical navigation, they haven't changed at all. You just have to learn how to read the terrain that's actually in the room with you.
Which is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to this deep dive, custom tailored for you, the advanced practice nursing student. Consider this your specialized one-on-one clinical tutoring session.
It's a really vital one, too. There are an estimated 1.4 million transgender individuals in the U.S. right now.
Wow.
Yeah, and they face disproportionately reduced access to healthcare. And the biggest barrier isn't a lack of specialized clinics. It's really just a lack of healthcare provider confidence.
Because when providers aren't confident, they hesitate, right?
Exactly. They hesitate, they make assumptions, or they just inadvertently alienate the patient. So
our mission today is to master the source material here, which is Chapter 79, Primary Care of Patients Who Are Transgender. We're going beyond the surface-level definitions to prep you for your exams and, more importantly, your daily practice.
Because caring for this population isn't about learning some, completely unrecognizable branch of medicine.
Right, no. It's about applying your rigorous primary care skills with precise anatomical and cultural awareness. So let's start by grounding ourselves in the clinical language.
Yeah, you really must distinguish between biological sex, which is the anatomy, and chromosomes assigned at birth, and gender identity.
Which is internal, right?
Exactly. It's a person's internal, deeply held sense of being male, female, neither, or, a combination. And the umbrella terms transgender or gender diverse are preferred because they encompass individuals regardless of whether they've had any medical interventions.
Right. Regardless of if they've tried to align their physical body with their identity. And that misalignment is often what brings them into the clinic, specifically under the diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
Which you, as an APRN, are absolutely on the front lines of screening for.
Yeah. And looking at the DSM-5-TR criteria, the differences between adults and children are actually pretty fascinating.
They really are.
For adults, you're looking for a marked incongruence between their experienced gender and their assigned gender that lasts at least 6 months.
Right. And it has to be accompanied by significant distress or impairment in social or occupational functioning.
But the insight there is the internal nature of it.
Yes, exactly. Adults have the cognitive framework to articulate this strong desire to rid themselves of their sex characteristics.
But pediatrics is a whole different ballgame.
Completely different. The pediatric criteria requires 6 specific symptoms present for 6 months.
Okay, what kind of symptoms?
You're looking for external things, like a strong preference for cross-dressing or a preference for toys culturally associated with another gender.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and a distinct vocalized dislike of their own anatomy.
Which makes perfect sense developmentally. Kids generally lack the complex vocabulary to express, existential incongruence.
Right, they can't just say, I feel this internal mismatch. So as a provider, you observe their behavioral rejections of those imposed norms.
Okay, so to treat this dysphoria, or honestly even just to treat their hypertension, you first have to get the patient to trust you enough to talk to you.
And that means understanding the demographics. We're looking at a highly diverse population. In the U.S., it's about 55% white, 21% Latino or Hispanic, and 16% African American.
But those numbers are probably way off, aren't they?
Well, almost certainly underreported. Societal stigma forces so many into the shadows, and that's just compounded by government forms that rigidly enforce binary gender options.
So since stigma is this massive barrier, the clinical interview basically has to be a masterclass in de-escalation.
It really does.
So if a student listening right now is terrified of saying the wrong thing, What is the absolute best practice to start the interview?
It's all about gender affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't guess.
Mm.
You ask the patient for their gender and their preferred pronouns at the very beginning.
And then document it, right?
Immediately. Put it in the electronic health record, so the MA, the phlebotomist, the front desk, everyone uses the correct language.
Because beyond just the verbal intake, your physical presence dictates the safety of the room.
Absolutely. Body language communicates compassion. You want to maintain steady eye contact, and this is key. Sit down so you aren't towering over them.
Right, don't rush it. And keep an open posture, like folding your arms physically walls you off.
Exactly. You want to visually communicate that your clinic is a safe haven. Because once that psychological safety is there, you have to gather a history that respects their identity while, meticulously capturing their physiological state.
Yeah. Looking at box 79.1 in the text, we're talking about a deeply focused medical history. You need a timeline of surgical interventions and a precise log of hormone therapies.
But you also really have to push on the reproductive history.
Right. I wanted to ask about that. For a trans man, someone assigned female at birth who identifies as male, why is assessing past conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome so critical?
Because those historical conditions dictate future physiological risks, especially when you introduce exogenous hormones.
Okay, how so?
Well, a history of PCOS already implies an altered metabolic baseline, right? Usually involving insulin resistance and endogenous androgen excess.
So if you're prescribing testosterone to that patient,
you must understand their baseline metabolic risk. You also have to sensitively assess sexual behaviors and the anatomy of their partners to guide your STI screening.
Got it. And I noticed the text also considers a spiritual history as a critical tool, which I sort of glossed over at first, but it makes perfect sense.
It's huge. You aren't just treating physical anatomy. You are navigating the mental health impacts of societal rejection.
Yeah, if a patient's religion heavily condemns gender diversity, that drives a ton of internal shame, which correlates right to anxiety and depression.
Which is why standard mental health screening tools, like the PHQ-9 and GAD-7, are just non-negotiable here. But that psychological distress can also manifest physically.
Right, as coping mechanisms. The text calls out some specific red flags that providers need to watch for.
Yeah, let's break those down. For trans women, the major one is tucking, which involves hiding the penis and scrotum, often by pushing the testicles up into the inguinal canal.
Which sounds incredibly uncomfortable.
It is, but the real physiological risk is that continual tucking artificially widens the inguinal canal,
creating a huge risk for hernias.
Exactly. And for trans men, the parallel red flag is chest binding. So, minimizing the appearance of breasts by tightly wrapping them.
Which compresses the thorax all day. They're severely limiting thoracic excursion.
Right. And restricted lung expansion leads to shortness of breath, recurrent respiratory infections, severe musculoskeletal pain, and even fungal infections under the binding material.
Wow. Okay, so understanding those modifications completely shifts how you approach the physical exam. You can't just run on autopilot.
No, not at all. As an APRN, your guiding principle has to be assess the anatomy that is in the room.
I love that phrasing, assess the anatomy in the room.
You focus entirely on the organs that are present, regardless of gender presentation. In a trans man, you mentally inventory if the breasts, vagina, uterus, or fallopian tubes are still there.
And in a trans woman, you identify if the testicles and prostate remain.
Exactly. But the absolute gold standard here is communication. Before your hands or stethoscope ever touch the patient, you have to provide a clear explanation of why each part of the exam is necessary.
Because explaining the why strips the awkwardness away, right?
Yes. It mitigates the profound embarrassment they might feel about their retained anatomy. It shows you're focused on safety, not just being a voyeur.
Makes total sense. Okay, so moving from the physical exam to the internal baseline, we hit a major clinical hurdle, lab assessments.
Yeah, this is tricky. Currently, there are no transgender-specific normal laboratory reference ranges.
Right. So you're forced to use standard male or female ranges, but you have to contextualize every value based on their hormone regimen. I like to think of it like reading a car's dashboard.
That's a great analogy.
It's not just knowing if it runs on gas or diesel. The hormones actually upgrade or downgrade the engine itself. Like if you prescribe testosterone to a trans man, you increase his muscle mass.
Right.
And more muscle naturally creates a higher exhaust output of muscle breakdown products. So you'll see higher baseline creatinine levels compared to a standard female range.
And if you don't understand that mechanism, you might falsely diagnose early-stage kidney disease. Hematocrit is another perfect example of that engine upgrade. Testosterone stimulates the kidneys to produce more erythropoietin.
which signals the bone marrow to pump out red blood cells.
Exactly. So a trans man on testosterone will present with an elevated hematocrit, pushing into the standard cisgender male range.
And conversely, a trans woman on androgen blockers will have reduced testosterone, leading to a lower hematocrit.
Right. If you fail to contextualize the dashboard based on the fuel they're using, you're going to chase false diagnoses all day long.
So as the prescribing APRN, you have to deeply understand these pharmacokinetics. Let's dive into the actual intervention, starting with transmenso, female-to-male transition.
The primary pharmacological intervention is testosterone, and the goal is virilization.
So cessation of menses, deepening of the vocal cords, facial hair, muscle mass.
Yes. And surgically, they have several options. They might undergo an oophorectomy to remove the ovaries, a hysterectomy, a vaginectomy, or a mastectomy.
But the genital reconstructive surgeries get super complex. Let's clarify this for a student studying for boards. What is the exact mechanical difference between a metoidioplasty and a phalloplasty?
Great question. A metoidioplasty constructs a neopenis by altering the patient's existing clitoris, which is usually enlarged from the testosterone.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The surgeon lengthens the urethra and positions it through this neopenis. It allows the trans man to urinate standing up, and because it relies on native erectile tissue, spontaneous erections are possible.
Even though the organ is quite small.
Exactly. A phalloplasty, on the other hand, is a much more extensive reconstruction.
Right, because it creates a larger adult-sized neopenis using skin grafts.
Yes, usually from the forearm, thigh, or abdomen. And because that grafted tissue doesn't have natural erectile tissue, it requires a mechanical penile implant later on to achieve an erection.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the goals for male-to-female transition in trans women? It requires a completely different strategy.
Completely different. The priority is suppressing the endogenous system to reduce facial hair and muscle, while introducing exogenous hormones to induce breast formation and redistribute fat.
And the surgeries reflect that. You've got orchiectomy to remove the testicles, penectomy, breast augmentation, and vaginoplasty.
The mechanism of a vaginoplasty is actually fascinating. The surgeon typically uses the inverted skin of the scrotum and penis to construct the vaginal canal.
Which preserves the nerve endings for sensation.
Exactly.
But that means the prostate is not removed. We will definitely come back to why that anatomical fact is so critical for primary care. But first, a vital reminder from the text. Not every transgender patient wants surgery.
Oh, absolutely not. Many don't even want hormones.
Right. You cannot assume a patient's goals. Your job isn't to force them down a specific medicalized pathway. It's to facilitate the individualized pathway they actually want.
But for those who do pursue pharmacological transition, the APRN is the primary gatekeeper for safety.
Right. You're managing incredibly powerful endocrine shifts. Let's look at Table 79.1. For testosterone in trans men, your clinical target is to maintain serum levels that match cisgender males.
Typically between 400 and 700 nanograms per deciliter.
And monitoring that requires blood work every 3 months for the first year. What major adverse effects are we watching for?
We already mentioned erythrocytosis. You're also monitoring for bone demineralization, and you have to watch their lipid panels closely. Testosterone can alter cholesterol processing, which increases the risk of heart disease.
And what if a trans man experiences persistent uterine bleeding despite the testosterone?
The standard intervention is adding an oral progestin, like medroxyprogesterone, to halt the bleeding.
Okay, got it. Now, the medication regimen for trans women is a bit more multifaceted, right?
It is. It often begins with androgen blockers like spironolactone or cyproterone to suppress male characteristics.
Wait, if spironolactone is an androgen blocker, why do the guidelines stress monitoring blood pressure so intensely?
Oh, right, because it's fundamentally a potassium-sparing diuretic. Precisely. It acts as an aldosterone antagonist in the kidneys. The anti-androgen effect is technically secondary.
Right.
So because it promotes diuresis, profound hypotension and hyperkalemia are the major adverse effects you have to anticipate.
As for estrogens, what are the absolute biggest safety red flags an APRN student needs to lock in?
Estrogens induce a prothrombotic state. They increase the synthesis of clotting factors in the liver.
So blood clots?
Yes. Venous thromboembolism, or VTE, and cardiovascular disease are the most critical red flags. If a patient has a history of VTE, severe liver dysfunction, or stroke, estrogen is strictly contraindicated.
And you monitor for breast cancer once the tissue develops?
Exactly. The regimen also includes GnRH agonists, which suppress testicular testosterone but carry risks like accelerated bone density loss and even seizures.
Wow, seizures. And then there's finasteride, which is an interesting tool. It blocks the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, stopping testosterone from converting into DHT.
And DHT is the highly potent androgen responsible for male pattern baldness.
So it prevents hair loss in trans women. But crucially, because it blocks DHT, finasteride is also the primary pharmacological treatment for BPH benign prostatic hypertrophy.
Which loops right back to our earlier anatomical point. Trans women who have had gender-affirming surgery still have an intact prostate.
Which brings us to the final phase of care, preventative screening. Beyond the transition care, these patients are going to age. They get the exact same systemic ailments as cisgender folks.
But their health promotion has to be tailored to their retained anatomy and their specific lifetime hormone exposure.
Right, like cardiovascular screening. Estrogen increases clotting risks, and testosterone lowers HDL while raising total cholesterol. Couple that with a statistically higher prevalence of smoking in this population.
And the cardiovascular risk profile is severe. Bone health is the other major vulnerability. Bone mineral density relies on sex hormones.
So when you alter those over decades, osteoporosis risk spikes.
Exactly. For trans women, guidelines dictate screening for osteoporosis at age 65 or between 50 and 65 if they've been off estrogen for more than 5 years.
And trans men.
Generally, they don't need routine bone screening unless they fail to maintain physiological male levels of testosterone.
Then we reach cancer screenings, where that rule, assess the anatomy in the room, becomes literally a matter of life and death.
Yes. If a trans man has not undergone a mastectomy, he retains breast tissue and is at risk for breast cancer. You must order annual mammograms starting at age 45.
And if he hasn't had a hysterectomy or vaginectomy, he retains the cervix and uterus, meaning he requires a pap smear every 3 years for ages 21 to 29 and HPV screening every 5 years up to age 65.
Because the mechanism of HPV causing cervical dysplasia doesn't care about gender identity.
Right. It only cares that the squamous epithelial cells are present. Also, if a trans man is having sex with biological males, you cannot assume infertility just because he's on testosterone. You have to do routine pregnancy testing.
And we follow the exact same logic for trans women. As we establish, a vaginoplasty does not involve surgical excision of the prostate.
Therefore, trans women are still physiologically susceptible to prostate cancer. You have to be prepared to perform digital rectal exams and order PSA screenings.
But think about the psychological barrier this creates.
Oh, it's massive. Imagine a trans man, full beard, deep voice, sitting in a highly gendered pastel pink gynecological waiting room for a pap smear.
The fear of being outed or harassed is a very real blockade to life-saving care.
Which is where you, as an APRN, become indispensable. You cannot allow a patient to fall through the cracks because of administrative stigma. You have to create an inclusive environment and confidently perform these exams yourself.
And that really synthesizes the core message here. Caring for transgender patients doesn't require impossibly complex training.
Right. It requires foundational clinical skills applied with rigorous cultural empathy. Understanding the physiological mechanisms of their hormones and applying standard primary care to the anatomy that is actually present.
If you can master that, if you can read the dashboard correctly and understand the fuel the engine is running on, you will be a phenomenal life-saving provider.
Absolutely. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought as you prep for your exams. The data explicitly shows that early access to gender-affirming hormones drastically reduces rates of severe dysphoria, depression, and suicidality.
It is literally life-saving preventative there.
So as a future APRN, how can you go beyond just treating the patient in front of you? How can you use your clinical authority to advocate at the community level to dismantle the barriers that delay this crucial care?
Because that advocacy is the true art and science of advanced practice nursing.
Very well said. From all of us at the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep studying hard, trust your clinical reasoning, and good luck on your exams and in your future practice.